Gavin, thank you so much for joining us once again on Fully Scored. I can't believe it, but it's been about 20 episodes since we last heard from you, so it's great to hear your voice again.
Thank you, Matthew. It's great to be back. Obviously, this time with a slightly different emphasis, getting to look at some really important repertoire in the Salvation Army vast library of music that exists for brass bands, and it's just a great delight to be back here doing this.
And as you've alluded to, you're going to be looking at and doing an analysis for us today of Morley Calvert's Easter meditation, For Our Transgressions. Before we chat about the actual music itself, could you give us a little bit of context into the life and influence of Morley Calvert?
Yes, it was been quite a joy to look into a little bit more of Morley Calvert's life, as well as looking into this music itself. And one thing that struck me is, if you've ever wondered who might be the most frequently performed Canadian composer outside of that vast country, it's most likely Morley Calvert. Keith Kinder, whose reputation was made as a music professor at the McMaster University, wrote quite an in-depth study of Morley Calvert, and he said in that Calvert had written as many as 90 works during his lifetime, and he may be the most frequently performed Canadian composer outside of the country. But whether that bold claim is validated or not, I do think that it endorses the fact that Morley Calvert's reputation as a composer extends beyond what we know within the Salvation Army. Kinder goes on to say in his book, which is called The Musical Life of Morley Calvert, he says this: Calvert's compositional output encompasses many genres, but overall is characterised by one common element. Virtually all was written for a particular event, group, or purpose. Above all, Calvert was a practical musician. He composed for his own groups, for ensembles with which he was associated, or on commission. Although these constrictions limited what he could create, he demonstrated a great deal of imagination in writing within them.
Fantastic.
So the book goes on to say that Calvert's harmonic practice remained largely within the confines of tonality, and I think we would certainly be able to confirm that from the music that we know of his. Although he did want to stretch the boundaries of the tonal system into the expanded tonality of the 20th century. So he certainly wasn't a man to rest on his laurels, to kind of make his music predictable in any way. It does seem as though a lot of his experimentation, if we want to call it that, included the use of non-functional harmonies, modality, polytonality, even tetrachords of varying intensity and dissonance. But he was certainly a pragmatic writer. That's pretty much clear.
Great stuff.
And it was argued within this book that Morley Calvert, probably alongside Howard Cable, one of the first Canadian composers to gain widespread success with his works for band, was probably right up there as the most significant of Canadian composers.
It's really fascinating to hear. I'd never thought that Calvert could be one of the most performed musicians outside of Canada from that country. That is really interesting. So when we speak about Morley Calvert's life, what sort of era and dates are we talking about?
Okay, so he was born in Ontario in June 1928. Morley then moved to Montreal with his family in 1930 because his father was transferred with work, so of course the whole family went there. And it was there that the young Morley Calvert grew up and then later pursued much of his professional career. It would appear that music came quite naturally to Morley Calvert. His parents were Salvationists and actively involved in the busy music programme at their church. His father, Thomas Calvert, who incidentally was often known as Fred. Quite where they got that from, I don't know. But yes, Fred Calvert, or Thomas Calvert, was an outstanding euphonium player. And his mother, Margaret, sang with the songsters. However, music in the family had a much longer history than that. Fred's father, Morley Calvert's grandfather, was a noted musician who served for a time as the bandmaster at the Peterborough and then later the Oshawa Temple Corps. It does appear certainly that Morley was exceptionally talented. He was blessed with perfect pitch. Nice. And had an extraordinary musical memory. Like many of us, of course, began playing the cornet at the Salvation Army Church. He was about 8 years old, and he was playing with the Montreal Citadel Senior Band probably around age 11 or 12. So he was clearly a very mature player, although the reason why he was playing with the band so young was probably because of other band members being enlisted and deployed during the war. But he joined formally, age 14, and regularly attended the Salvation Army's summer camp at Jackson's Point. And one of his earliest compositions actually was a piano piece called Memories of Jackson's Point. So it obviously had quite a profound effect on him, something I'm sure that we can and our listeners can testify to, those who have been to those Salvation Army summer camps. They do make a lasting impression and really inspire young Salvatious musicians on their way. But then came a more formal music education. He had piano lessons with another very famous Salvation Army name, Norman Audouin, the composer of Montreal Citadel. And that study also included a licentiate of the Royal Schools of Music. He got that in 1948. And then he became an associate in music from the McGill University in Montreal. And then studied for a Bachelor of Music degree, again from McGill. And perhaps for those of us who aren't from North America, it's probably worth saying that the McGill University is a really prestigious university, often referred to as the Harvard of Canada. So he clearly was a very bright gentleman as well as an outstanding musician.
And for those that aren't from North America, Harvard's often referred to as the McGill of North America.
Quite possibly.
Yeah. So alongside that prestigious education, presumably Calvert had quite an active role at the court?
Yes. At the Montreal Citadel, he became the songster leader before taking over as the bandmaster for a whole decade between 1960 and 1970. Morley Calvert left Montreal in 1969 to do a master's qualification in London, UK. Now, whilst in London, I do know that Morley Calvert had something in common with both you and I, in that he played for the ISB for just the year, but he did play with the ISB.
Fantastic. Really fascinating to hear some of that background in the life of a composer that I guess, well, I certainly didn't know that much about. So thank you for doing that research and enlightening us all with that. So let's talk about his music. What is it about Calvert's compositions that make them so unique?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the music of his that I've listened to in recent weeks whilst preparing for this, they're mostly light and quite pleasing works. I think it's fair to say that much of his compositional work presents modest to little technical demand to achieve what he was looking for. They're very playable and often orchestrated quite lightly, always very graceful, kind of like a chamber-like accompaniment. Many of his works, it would appear, do include folk songs. He clearly had a passion for very strong tunes, very old tunes, and I guess it's very accessible due to the many folk-like melodies that he employs. When I looked a little closer at some of his compositions, it does reveal certain fingerprints, as it does for most composers, and probably a preferred way of working. His approach to tonality, for example, involves lots of major and minor sevenths, and lots of added note chords as well. He seems to use the diminished seventh chord a lot, and much like the great Wagner, he seemed to prefer the sound of a half-diminished chord, series of minor thirds with the exception of a major third between the third and fourth notes. So he certainly did have his fingerprints, the things that he went back to time and time again, the things that worked for him. There are many other added notes that he often used to give his harmonies that kind of rather distinctive flavour. But I'd say that it's probably Morley Calvert's devotional work, For Our Transgressions, which for me illustrates, yes, his compositional fingerprints, but also the depth of his spiritual experience, as well as it just being, as I say, purely an outstanding piece of writing.
So whereabout in Calvert's writing and output would this piece fall?
Okay, so I've got a rather beaten up score from the Birmingham Citadel Band Library, and the date on the front of this is March 1957. So this was written before Morley became bandmaster at Montreal Citadel, but I would suggest that it was likely written for Montreal Citadel Band, given his characteristic of often writing for groups that he was associated with. It was actually the third devotional work of his that the UK Music Editorial Board had published, and this was by some way the most developed, large-scale, almost programmatic work of the three that had been published to this point. Ray Steadman Allen wrote the programme notes in the score, and as I flick through these, he certainly reflected that the music was deeply emotional, he uses those words, and that the craftsmanship displayed in the handling of the material was mature and assured. So if the great RSA rated him, I guess he must be doing okay. Obviously, when we look at the inspiration for this work, it's clearly Scripture, and clearly the title of this work comes directly from verse 5 of the 53rd chapter of Isaiah, where it says, "He was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed."
And without further ado, let's delve into the score itself and look through the music, shall we?
Yeah, we start with the introduction, where Morley Calvert starts with a motif that is taken from the chorus "Out of his wounded side." This motif is transformed into an imitative figure as the fragment of this tune is passed between the flugel and solo horn as a pair, and then onto the baritones and euphoniums, and then the cornets. Notice how the motif is treated, first of all in unison, before being harmonised, exploring it in different registers, different timbres, and also towards the end, diminution of that motif as we move towards the end of the introduction, and that provides an intensity in the music as we head to the agitato at letter A. Now, at letter A, we hear what RSA calls the motto theme for the whole work. It's kind of like that one motif that is present throughout. It's firstly presented in the solo cornet line. Now, the reason he calls it so is because from this point onwards, there is not a single page of the score where the motif does not occur in some way, shape, or form. Themes and motifs have always been used as glue in music. It's been the case for centuries. It wasn't new then, and it's certainly not new now. And any sophisticated work will almost certainly have these unifying themes. It's the conductor's job, of course, to try and bring these out of the texture and to allow the frequent appearances to fuse the music through familiarity of themes for the listener. So we now move to letter B, and this is the first of the 4 featured hymns out of his wounded side. Now, the tune itself is presented in a way that stays faithful to the original Sidney Cox song, but it is accompanied by the motto theme that we've just spoken about, and it's been reinforced in the solo cornet and also the euphonium. Here we see Calvert's trademark clear and light scoring that resembles the scoring of chamber music. The score is really uncluttered, and much like in chamber music, most of the instruments get their moment in the sun to play a melody or a counter melody or something of interest. Even if we look at the 8th bar of letter B, the tubas having their treatment of the motto theme, so everyone gets their opportunity to shine.
And that takes us into letter C.
Yeah, letter C, probably more of a transitionary section, I would say, at letter C. And so Calvert returns to his motto theme. We hear an adapted version of this motif in the euphoniums, and it's then developed further as it moves around the band. The first cornet, flugelhorn, baritones, basses, they all have it, and other instruments besides. Emerging from this motivic development is the reference to the second hymn, and the second hymn is Life for a Look. Whilst not accented in any way, and certainly still a mezzo piano dynamic, for me this melody should probably emerge from the emotional and passionate motto theme with an ever increasing insistence. It is almost as though we are kind of there at the foot of the cross, watching and being encouraged to consider looking upon Christ's sacrifice and being saved at that very moment as each successive repetition of the phrase is played louder and higher in pitch. There's a real intensity here. This momentary intense and impassioned section subsides, and we return to the tenderness of the hymn Life for a Look at letter D. And there is little deviation away from what we would have heard from a song accompaniment in church on a Sunday morning. We assume that the intended verse here is verse 1. It doesn't tell us that, but it would seem to make sense. And the words associated with verse 1 are, "There is life for a look at the crucified one. There's a life at this moment for thee. Then look, sinner, look unto him and be saved, unto him who was nailed to a tree." Now, although there is a great challenge to be found in some of the other verses of this song, either way, the words associated with this melody really make this moment in the piece very personal, and the intimate setting with no complex scoring only adds to the poignancy and the directness of this message.
So as we get to letter E, where are we in the structure of this song?
So we've had the verse at letter D, and letter E is the chorus of Life for a Look. We see a return of the motto theme, but I personally, and it is my choice, always like to build a slight accelerando here. For me, the repetition of the words in the chorus, look, look, look and live, that repetition of the word look, suggests an urgency as we are being encouraged to look at Jesus and his sacrifice and accept his grace. Now, it seems to work fairly well to have that sense of urgency in the music, to reflect the perceived urgency in the words, before we then settle back into the gentle presentation from bar 3 of letter E. We never quite finish the chorus of Life for a Look before we are interrupted by the emotional motto theme. And we've seen this in other iconic pieces of Salvation Army music literature. We think of pieces like The Present Age, deny thee never. And we never actually hear the word never, because at that moment in the piece, the person can't quite bring himself to say that word. And here, perhaps we've got a person stood metaphorically at the foot of the cross, considering the sacrifice of what it means to them, and perhaps finds it all just too much to bear, breaks away from the chorus, unable to commit to that final line. Is this gift of grace really for me? I guess we've all kind of been there at some point. And the emotion takes hold, and it's once again portrayed through the motto theme which we hear. And this extended period of passion and urgency subsides once more as we approach letter F, almost as though the person regains composure, signalled by the 3 accented notes in open fifths in the trombones and the basses.
So that takes us, as you said, to letter F.
This seems like, to me, a series of questions. We hear reference to the words, "There is life for a look at the crucified one," but we never complete the line. The phrase is interrupted by a chromatic shift that brings about a sense of questioning. Is there really something in this sacrifice for me? It's almost as though the preacher, or the one challenging our character, is saying, I've laid it all out and I've pleaded with you. Now, will you choose to believe and accept? And following this, there is agitation in the writing, with brief references to a number of the chosen hymns, as well as an increase in the tempo and the pitch and the dynamics. And before it is brought to an abrupt end with a general pause, like absolute silence, which is a brave move in itself. And for me, that's the hesitation. Our person has been stopped in their tracks. This is a huge moment for them. And it's followed by an awakening of 3 notes at pianissimo, perhaps the realisation, one might say. Now, letter G, and certainly the anacrusis into letter G, is a burst of anguish and pain. We've gone from the silence and the 3 pianissimo notes to 3 notes at fortissimo, and all accented. The marking con angoscia means just that, with anxiety, with anguish, and with grief. This could be continuing the narrative of the person before the cross, or perhaps could reflect the pain and anguish of the crucifixion itself, or indeed could even further depict the words of the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah 53, chapter 4, "Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows." Each 3 of those, for me, legitimately could be a reason why Morley Calvert has written the music this way. There is significant chromatic movement here to heighten the anguish, as well as some false relation as well. You'll see we've got concert E flats in the basses, clashing with E naturals in the euphonium and trombone. So again, here's that fingerprint that we were talking about earlier on. Morley Calvert isn't afraid to expand the harmonic language within his music, even what could be perceived as quite functional music for Salvation Army groups that he knows well. He still has that fingerprint of pushing back boundaries. The agitation then subsides, and that's reflected in volume, in pace, in harmony as well. And like ripples in a pond, the tension slowly dissolves through a descending sequence, a very controlled diminuendo, and, as I say, the slowing of the tempo.
So that takes us to letter H in the music.
The music kind of comes to rest in the most tranquil of ways, really, letter H. We have a calming presentation of just the chorus to "The Wounds of Christ Are Open." And once again, Morley Calvert adopts a simple approach to scoring, characteristically, which again brings an air of sincerity, personal prayer perhaps, to the chorus that's being used. The words are, "The wounds of Christ are open. Sinner, they were made for thee. The wounds of Christ are open. There for refuge flee." And the descending chromatic bass line just further adds a sense of coming to the realisation of Christ's sacrifice, as well as adding to the sense of grief and sorrow. And then we come to letter I. In letter I, Morley Calvert continues with his reiteration that the wounds of Christ were made for you and I, but he develops the scoring and he adds a counter melody this time in the form of the final of the 4 hymns used in this work. It's a very different setting of "I Shall Know Him." The original hymn was often played with quite a bright tempo and a bit of a bounce to it, but Calvert uses a much more reflective setting, and he uses it as a counter melody, which is really clever and inspired that he was able to spot its qualities as a counter melody rather than the kind of main event, and he uses it as that counter melody to the repetition of "The wounds of Christ are open." It is scored in terms of the harmony in the cornets and horn, and it once again makes this a moment of intense personal testimony as the individual is in dialogue with the reiteration of "The wounds of Christ are open" and the realisation of "I shall know him, I shall know him, when redeemed by his side I shall stand. I shall know him, I shall know him, by the print of the nails," and it should go on to say, "on his hands." But we never finish that final sentence. And perhaps this is the most poignant moment in this work, the realisation perhaps of just what Christ did for us. The break from the phrase is on the word nails, and those 2 notes associated with that word nails are repeated twice, with nails almost being side, reflecting the extent of the sorrow and the brutality of the crucifixion. The motto theme, that's still there, it always is, in the texture, this time in the euphonium, kind of unifying the work at its very conclusion. And then finally we come to letter J. As the music draws to a close, we hear a further reference to the tune "Out of His Wounded Side," the song that we hear at the very beginning of the work, ending in a very similar way to which it began. There are still moments of tension in the score. We see the chromatic upward move in bar 2 of letter J being an example of this, which ensures that the emotion remains in the music right to the very end. And there's also a clever use of the first bar of the melody associated with "out of his wounded side," as we are almost reminded by several sections of the band that what this music is really about. God's love and God's grace for us all through the ultimate sacrifice in Christ's sacrifice.
thank you so much, Gavin, for unpacking that music and for giving us some context into the music, but also really revealing the poignancy behind the melodies and the words associated with that music. So appropriate for this time, just after Easter. One final question for you. Is there any particular recording or performance of this work that you've been involved in, or maybe even not involved in, that means something personally to you?
Yeah, and as I say, we recorded this quite early on in my tenure as bandmaster with the Birmingham Citadel Band. I don't suggest for one moment that it's a definitive recording to stand up alongside some of the other greats that are no doubt out there. But for me personally, that would be a highlight. It's my core band that I've been a part of for a number of years, whether as a player or more recently as its conductor. But that was a very special time, and I think that the band really grasped something of the ministry within the music, as well as actually giving a pretty decent reading of the music itself as well. Purely from a musical level, this guy is a very, very gifted musician and an outstanding writer, and that's evidenced through this music. But as I said earlier, what's also very, very clear is his Christian message and testimony coming through the music. His faith is always very clear, and the way in which he's able to communicate that through his musicianship is really a wonder to behold, and for me makes this piece stand up alongside the very best of Salvation Army music over the years.
And listeners may be interested to know that recording you mentioned is what we've used as our musical excerpts in this recording as well.
Wonderful.